The Renaissance and Reformation, the cultural revival and religious protest in the 1400s and 1500s. The word Renaissance means rebirth. It refers to the rediscovery of classic Greek and Roman art and culture between the years 1350 and 1550. During this time, Italy was developing urban society. Powerful city-states were the centers of economic, social, and political power. These city-states were secular or non-religious. There were three causes of the Renaissance. The first was the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-1300s, reducing the population. This gave the remaining workers more freedom and power to move around and to take different jobs that paid better. The second cause was a revival of trade between Europe and the Middle East. Italian merchants began trading with Muslim merchants, gaining things such as spices. Finally, we have political stability. Fewer wars were being fought in Europe by the early 1400s, allowing people to focus on new things other than survival. So the Black Death first swept across Europe in 1348. Somewhere between 10% and 30% of Europe's population died as a result of the plague, putting the surviving commoners in a better position to bargain for better pay and better working conditions, and helping lead to the development of a wealthy merchant class. The renewal of trade between Europe and the Middle East led to increased wealth for merchants, access to classic Greek and Roman texts and knowledge, and new ideas from Muslims. Several major city-states in Italy, including Milan, Venice, and Florence, developed independent secular governments, mostly republics. Wealthy merchants in the city-states competed with one another to spend vast amounts of money to create civic art and architecture for their cities. This is a map of northern Italy showing some of the important independent republics. Unlike France or England, Italy was not a united country. Instead, the Italian peninsula was controlled by several independent republics, powerful city-states that controlled trade in the Mediterranean. One important individual in politics in the northern Italian city-states was a man named Niccolò Machiavelli. He was a Florentine politician who was actually kicked out of his city by Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Machiavelli wrote a book for Lorenzo called The Prince, in which he discussed how a leader could acquire and keep power. In The Prince, Machiavelli stated that it was better for a leader to be feared than to be loved. Marriages in Renaissance Italy were usually arranged by the bride's and groom's parents, and the bride's family had to pay a dowry to the groom, a sum of money or goods that represented a sum of money. Men had absolute authority within the household. In fact, in Italy, children were not legally adults until their father went before a judge and freed them. Young men and women could become adults anywhere between the ages of 16 and their mid-20s. One of the developments during the Renaissance was an intellectual movement called humanism. Humanism emphasized human achievement and focused on studying the classics, also called the humanities. Subjects such as grammar, rhetoric or argument, poetry, philosophy, and history. All these subjects were studied in the humanism movement, and it was all based on the teachings of ancient Greeks and Romans. The father of humanism is a man by the name of Petrarch, an Italian intellectual. He looked at ancient Roman texts and encouraged others to look for lost Latin works. During the Renaissance, individuals started to write in the vernacular, the local language of a place. Prior to this, all important writings were written in Latin. But the vernacular became popular during the Renaissance, with authors such as Dante and Geoffrey Chaucer using vernacular to compose great works. Dante was an Italian poet who wrote a poem called the Divine Comedy, an epic poem about his search for a woman named Beatrice through hell and heaven. His depiction of hell, with its ironic punishments for sinners, featured dozens of real-life people, many of them Dante's critics, suffering under his imaginative tortures. Geoffrey Chaucer was an English poet who wrote the Canterbury Tales, a series of stories told by various pilgrims on their way to the city of Canterbury. The stories are filled with all sorts of dirty jokes, because even stuffy old English poets like a good fart joke. The key development during the Renaissance was in art. Italian artists developed processes such as frescoes, which is a painting technique that applied paint directly to wet plaster in a wall, so that the painting would become part of the wall as it dried. Frescoes were pioneered by a Florentine painter named Masaccio in the early 1400s. The image on this slide is of Masaccio's Tribute Money, one of the earliest Renaissance paintings. It uses perspective to give the scene a sense of depth that medieval art lacked. Renaissance painters learned the laws of perspective and developed a better understanding of shading and light to create more realistic-looking art. Perspective is a technique that gives the illusion of depth to an image, creating a vanishing point that things are moving towards so that it appears that things have depth. Renaissance artists also learned about human anatomy and studied how the body moves to create more accurate figures. The image is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, a study of motion and human anatomy. Renaissance sculptors borrowed from ancient Greek and Roman techniques to give their work a sense of balance and movement. To the right is Donatello's statue, David, done in bronze. Renaissance architecture was designed using arches and columns, making it like classic Greek and Roman architecture. For example, we have the San Lorenzo Church in Florence, Italy, an example of Renaissance architecture designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. The high point of the Renaissance was called the High Renaissance. It lasted from 1490 to 1520. It was during this time that most of the most well-known Renaissance artists were working. For example, Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was a painter, inventor, and master of human anatomy. He experimented with a variety of new techniques to get to the true nature of a subject, going beyond simple realism. Here are some examples of his works. We have the Mona Lisa, we have the Last Supper, and at the bottom we have a detail from one of Da Vinci's sketches showing a design for a helicopter. Another famous high Renaissance painter was a man named Raphael. He was most well known for painting Madonnas, which are paintings of the Virgin Mary, and for his fresco The School of Athens, depicting Plato and many of his students walking through his famous academy. Finally, we have the high Renaissance artist Michelangelo, a painter, sculptor, and architect. He was famous for his statue of David and for painting the entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel with various scenes from the Bible. The Renaissance did not just stay in Italy. There was something called the Northern Renaissance, which was the spread of Italian Renaissance ideals to an area known as the Low Countries, which are in present-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Artists in the Northern Renaissance worked with smaller spaces than Italian painters, often using oil paints and wood carvings. Rather than trying to create an idealized human or perfect human form, Northern Renaissance artists focused on copying lots of details from the world around them. Here are two examples of Northern Renaissance art. To the left, we have Jan van Eyck's The Arnolfini Marriage. It's one of the best-known Northern Renaissance works. To the right, we have Albrecht Dürer's woodcut, part of a famous series of woodcuts that he created for a small book. As the Renaissance emphasized a focus on human achievement, this movement expanded into other elements of society. One example would be Christian humanism, a movement that emerged in the 1500s in the Low Countries out of humanism, and that focused specifically on reforming the Catholic Church. It was based primarily on the teachings of a man named Erasmus, a Christian humanist who developed a philosophy of Christ that said people should focus on their personal relationship with God and try to live good lives. Unfortunately, Christian humanism did not gain support from priests and therefore died out rather quickly. Another concern in the late 1400s and early 1500s were a group of popes known as the Renaissance popes. These men ruled the papacy between 1450 and 1520, and all of them were focused on secular or non-religious and spiritual matters. Their reigns damaged the reputation of the Roman Catholic Church. Many people during this time were concerned about their salvation or acceptance into heaven, and felt that the popes were more concerned with governing the papal states than with protecting people's souls. During this time, the church also began selling things called indulgences. These were releases from punishment for sin. Many people also bought relics, which are objects related to holy people, in the hopes of reducing the amount of time their soul would have to spend in purgatory. One of the most well-known sellers of indulgences in the early 1500s was a monk named Johann Tetzel, a man famous for saying, "When the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Not everyone liked the sale of indulgences and relics. One man, named Martin Luther, was a German monk and theology professor who wanted to reform the church. After years of study, he came to believe in something called justification by faith alone. The idea that a human could never perform enough good works to achieve salvation, and that a person was saved only because God was merciful and chose to let that person be saved. Luther spent years thinking about what he called the salvation question. How does one achieve salvation? He read the Bible over and over, searching for an answer. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that the only thing a person needed for salvation was faith in Jesus, as that was all the Bible ever said was necessary. This went against the doctrine and teachings of the Catholic Church, which said people also needed to practice the 7 sacraments to achieve salvation. In 1517, Luther posted something called the 95 Theses, a list of issues that he wanted to reform in the church. He posted the 95 Theses to the door of the church building in Wittenberg, Germany, on October 31st, 1517. The 95 Theses spread quickly across Germany and even the rest of Europe, though the Pope at the time ignored them. By 1520, Luther, frustrated with the lack of results from his 95 Theses, was calling for German princes to break away from the Catholic Church. He started to call for lots of other reforms as well. Luther's 95 Theses were a scathing criticism of the practices of the Catholic Church. The practice of nailing statements like this to the door of a local church was an old one. People would post important thoughts and statements on the church door because that was a place everyone in town would go each week, guaranteeing your audience would see your statement. Johann Tetzel, the indulgence seller, responded to Luther's 95 Theses with his own 105 Theses a short time later, arguing that his statements were superior because there were more, and proving that monks are a lot cattier than anyone previously believed. Part of this whole argument is over the sacraments, holy rituals that were practiced by the church. The Catholic Church had 7 of them. There was baptism at birth, Holy Communion, the confession of sins, confirmation when an individual became a young adult, marriage, the ordination of priests, and finally, last rites at death. Luther, on the other hand, felt that only 2 sacraments, baptism and communion, were necessary, because those were the only ones mentioned in the Bible. Luther believed that the Bible was the ultimate authority on what Christians ought to do, and all it said people had to do for salvation was believe in Jesus. Baptism and communion were worthwhile things, he thought, but they were not absolutely necessary for salvation. Because of his actions, Luther was excommunicated, or kicked out of the church, in 1521. Shortly thereafter, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V demanded that Luther appear before an imperial court in the city of Worms to explain himself. When Luther failed to appear, Charles V issued the Edict of Worms, an official statement by the Holy Roman Emperor declaring Luther an outlaw who was to be captured and executed for his betrayal of the church. Luther went into hiding and was protected by various nobles in the Holy Roman Empire. Luther and his followers formed the first Protestant church. Protestants are people who do not believe the Pope is the head of the church. This church today is called the Lutheran Church. Many nobles in the Holy Roman Empire joined the Lutheran Church, and Protestantism spread out across Europe. One area where Protestantism became very popular was in Switzerland. Men such as Ulrich Zwingli, a priest in the city of Zurich, attempted to create Protestant reforms. Unfortunately, Zwingli died in a battle against Catholic forces in 1531. Another Protestant, a Frenchman by the name of John Calvin, moved to Switzerland, where he published a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion, about basic Christian doctrine or beliefs. Calvin was a firm believer in a concept called predestination, the idea that God chooses who will be saved, a group called the elect, and who will be damned, a group called the reprobate, before people are even born. Our souls are predestined for a particular destination, Calvin believed. Calvin proposed a theology based on the absolute grace of God and the absolute depravity or worthlessness and undeservedness of man. His concept of predestination stated it was impossible for a person to know whether they were saved or damned, and that you had no control over it even if you did know. So as far as he was concerned, everyone ought to try to behave in a good Christian fashion anyway. Calvin was invited to the city of Geneva, Switzerland in 1536 in order to create a religious government following his religious rules. As a result of the success of Geneva, Calvinism became the most powerful form of Protestantism by 1550. Meanwhile, in England, Henry VIII, the King of England, was originally a strong supporter of the Pope who actually wrote against Luther. However, in 1533, he wanted to annul, or cancel, or make invalid his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, so that he might marry another woman named Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage, so the king broke away and formed his own church, the Church of England. In 1534, Parliament passed a law called the Act of Supremacy, declaring that the king was the head of the church in England. Henry got his annulment, eliminated the monasteries in England, and claimed all their land for himself. By the time Henry died in 1547, his sickly son, Edward VI, became king. Edward was a very Protestant individual, and moved England closer to Protestantism in his policies, but he died at a very young age in 1553. Henry VIII was married 6 times in his life. His first 3 wives each gave him a child, 2 daughters and a son, and all 3 children eventually went on to rule England. To the bottom right, we have a picture of his son, Edward VI, who died at the age of 15. Henry's oldest daughter, a girl by the name of Mary, was his daughter by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She became queen when her half-brother Edward died in 1553. Mary was a very Catholic individual and happened to be married to a man named Philip II, the King of Spain. During her short reign, she tried to make England Catholic again, but many, many people in the country rejected it and fought against her. Other religious groups began popping up all over Europe. One such group were the Anabaptists, a religious group who believed all Christians were equal, even women, and let each community choose its own minister. They were very firm believers in the separation of church and state. In other words, they didn't think religion had any business in government. They refused to hold political office or serve in the military because they might be called upon to kill someone, and the Bible was very clear about thou shalt not kill. The Catholic Church attempted to address the issues brought up by the Protestant Reformation in something called the Counter-Reformation, to fight back against the rise of Protestantism. There were 3 main parts to the Counter-Reformation. First was the Jesuits, a group also called the Society of Jesus. It was started by Ignatius of Loyola in 1540 and emphasized discipline and education. Second were papal reforms proposed by Pope Paul III in the 1540s, attempting to address many of the corruption issues that had plagued the papacy during the Renaissance. Finally, there was the Council of Trent, a meeting called in 1545 that reaffirmed basic Catholic doctrine, such as the importance of the sacraments and the necessity of the Pope as the head of the Church.